Maya Washington had established her morning routine 3 years ago, and she rarely deviated from it. Every day at 7 o'clock sharp, the 12-year-old girl would wake up, prepare a simple breakfast, and walk the 4 blocks to Mr. Harrison's small apartment on Maple Street. The ritual had begun quite by accident one winter morning when she'd seen the elderly man struggling to carry his groceries up the stairs. She'd helped him that day, and when she noticed how empty his refrigerator looked, something in her heart shifted. The next morning, she showed up with toast and jam, and she hadn't missed a day since. Mr. Harrison lived alone in a modest one-bedroom apartment that smelled faintly of old books and coffee. The walls were mostly bare except for a single black-and-white photograph that Maya had never asked about. It showed a group of young men in military uniforms, their faces serious and determined. Mr. Harrison never talked much about his past, and Maya never pressed him. She found comfort in their quiet mornings together, sharing simple meals while he told her stories about the neighborhood from decades past or helped her with her mathematics homework. Maya's own home life was complicated. Her mother worked 2 jobs to keep them afloat after her father had left when she was 6. Money was always tight, but her mother had taught her that kindness cost nothing and meant everything. So Maya saved her lunch money, shopped carefully at the discount grocery store, and made sure Mr. Harrison had something warm to eat each morning. She'd prepare scrambled eggs, oatmeal, or sometimes just buttered toast with fruit, depending on what she could afford that week. The other kids at school thought she was strange. They couldn't understand why she'd spend her time with an old man instead of hanging out before class or sleeping in on weekends. But Maya didn't mind being different. In Mr. Harrison, she'd found something she hadn't even known she was looking for, a quiet friendship that asked nothing of her except her presence. He never made her feel poor or pitted. He never asked intrusive questions about why her mother was never home or why she wore the same 3 outfits in rotation. This particular morning started like any other. Maya prepared cheese omelets with the last of the eggs she'd bought, carefully wrapped them in aluminum foil to keep them warm, and grabbed the thermos of coffee she'd made. The October air was crisp, and golden leaves skittered across the sidewalk as she walked. She climbed the familiar stairs to apartment 3B and knocked gently, not wanting to startle him. But this morning, when Mr. Harrison opened the door, Maya noticed something different in his eyes, a distant look, as if he were seeing something far beyond the walls of his small apartment. She didn't know it yet, but everything was about to change. Mr. Harrison seemed quieter than usual that morning, and Maya noticed his hands trembling slightly as he accepted the warm plate. She'd grown accustomed to reading his moods over the years, and today something felt different, heavier. As they sat at his small kitchen table, he kept glancing at that old photograph on the wall, the one with the young soldiers. Finally, he spoke in a voice that seemed to come from somewhere deep and distant. "Maya, there are things about my past I've never told anyone in this neighborhood," he began, his weathered hands wrapped around the coffee mug she'd brought. James Harrison had been 22 years old when he deployed to Vietnam in 1967. He'd been a radio operator in the Marine Corps, attached to a reconnaissance unit that operated deep in enemy territory. The work was dangerous, requiring them to move silently through jungles, gathering intelligence, and calling in coordinates for strikes. His unit had been awarded numerous commendations for their bravery, though James rarely thought about the medals anymore. What he remembered most were the faces of the men he'd served with, many of whom never made it home. Over the years, James had tried to leave that life behind. After returning stateside in 1970, he'd struggled to adjust to civilian life, as so many veterans did. The nightmares came frequently at first, and he found it difficult to hold down jobs or maintain relationships. He'd married once, briefly, but his wife couldn't understand the darkness that sometimes consumed him. He'd worked various jobs, construction, security, warehouse work, moving from city to city, trying to outrun memories that followed him everywhere. Eventually, he'd settled in this small apartment, living on his modest military pension and Social Security, keeping to himself and bothering no one. What Maya didn't know was that James had been part of a classified operation during his final months in Vietnam. His unit had rescued a group of prisoners of war from a camp deep in enemy territory, a mission that had been kept secret for decades due to its politically sensitive nature. 3 men from his unit had been killed during the extraction, and James himself had taken shrapnel in his leg, an injury that still ached on cold mornings. The rescued POWs had included the son of a high-ranking military official, though James never sought recognition or reward for his role in the mission. As James shared these fragments of his history with Maya, she listened with wide eyes, her breakfast forgotten on the plate before her. She'd never imagined that the gentle old man who helped her with fractions and told her funny stories about the neighborhood had lived such an extraordinary life. She didn't fully understand all the details. The military terminology confused her, and the geography of Vietnam was hazy in her young mind, but she understood the weight of what he was telling her. She understood that Mr. Harrison had saved lives, that he'd been brave when it mattered most, and that he'd carried these memories alone for far too long, like heavy stones in his pockets that no one else could see. 2 days after Mr. Harrison had begun sharing his stories, Maya was at home on a Saturday afternoon, helping her mother fold laundry in their small living room. The television murmured in the background, playing a rerun of an old game show. Maya's mother, Linda, hummed softly as she worked, enjoying one of her rare days off from both jobs. It was a peaceful moment, the kind that Maya had learned to treasure. Then came the knock at the door, firm, authoritative, and somehow different from the usual visitors they received. When Linda opened the door, she found herself facing 2 men in military dress uniforms. They stood straight and formal, their faces serious but not unkind. The taller of the 2, an African-American man with silver hair and numerous ribbons on his chest, introduced himself as Colonel Marcus Davis from the Department of Defense. His companion, a younger white officer with kind eyes, was Captain Jennifer Morrison. They asked if they could come inside to speak with Maya Washington. Linda's immediate reaction was panic, the kind of fear any mother feels when official-looking people come asking for her child. Her mind raced through possibilities, wondering if Maya had somehow gotten into trouble she didn't know about. Maya came to the door, her heart pounding. She'd never spoken to anyone in the military before, and seeing these imposing figures in their formal uniforms made her feel small and nervous. Colonel Davis smiled gently, seeming to sense her fear. "You're not in any trouble, young lady," he assured her. "In fact, we're here because of something very good you've been doing. Can we sit down and talk for a few minutes?" Linda invited them in, clearing magazines from the worn couch and offering coffee, which they politely declined. What the officers explained over the next 20 minutes seemed almost impossible to Maya. They told her that James Harrison had been located as part of a military initiative to honor veterans of classified operations that could now be declassified. During their investigation into his service record and current circumstances, they had discovered Maya's daily visits. A neighbor, Mrs. Chun from down the hall from Mr. Harrison, had mentioned to a military social worker that a young girl brought the elderly veteran breakfast every single morning. The social worker had reported this up the chain, and eventually it had reached Colonel Davis, who had himself served in a later conflict and had a deep respect for both veterans and the communities that supported them. Colonel Davis leaned forward, his voice warm with emotion. "Miss Washington, what you've been doing for Mr. Harrison, taking care of him, keeping him company, making sure he's not forgotten, that represents the very best of what our country should be. The military takes care of its own, but sometimes civilians like you do what we cannot. You've given a war hero dignity and friendship when he needed it most. We want to honor both Mr. Harrison for his service and you for your compassion." Maya sat stunned, unable to fully process what she was hearing. She'd never thought of her morning routine as anything special, just something that felt right. The idea that military officers had traveled here to talk about it seemed surreal, like something from a movie rather than her ordinary life on this ordinary Saturday afternoon. 3 weeks after the officer's visit, Maya found herself standing in a place she'd never imagined being, a formal military ceremony at the Regional Veterans Affairs Building. The large hall was decorated with American flags and filled with people in both military uniforms and civilian clothes. Maya wore a new dress that Colonel Davis's office had arranged for her, a simple navy blue outfit that made her feel grown up and nervous. Her mother sat in the front row, tears already shimmering in her eyes, proud and overwhelmed by the attention her daughter was receiving. Mr. Harrison sat in a place of honor on the stage, and Maya barely recognized him. Instead of his usual cardigan and worn slacks, he wore his old Marine Corps dress uniform, which had been tailored to fit his older frame. The medals and ribbons on his chest told a story Maya was only beginning to understand. He'd been reluctant about the ceremony at first, uncomfortable with attention after so many years of anonymity. But Colonel Davis had convinced him that it was important, not just for him, but for all the veterans whose service had gone unrecognized, and for young people like Maya who needed to see that kindness mattered. The ceremony began with a color guard presenting the flags, and everyone stood for the national anthem. Maya's heart thundered in her chest as various speakers took the podium. First, a congressman spoke about the importance of remembering veterans and the sacrifices they'd made. Then Captain Morrison shared the details of the classified operation that Mr. Harrison had participated in, explaining how his actions had saved lives and demonstrated extraordinary courage under fire. Finally, Colonel Davis approached the podium with a wooden box containing a Bronze Star Medal, an honor that had been approved decades ago but never formally presented because of the classified nature of the mission. As Mr. Harrison stood to receive his medal, the entire room rose in applause. Maya could see tears on his weathered cheeks, and her own eyes grew damp. But the ceremony wasn't over. Colonel Davis then called Maya to the stage. Her legs felt like rubber as she climbed the steps, acutely aware of all the eyes watching her. The colonel explained how Maya's simple act of kindness, bringing breakfast to a lonely veteran, exemplified the values that military personnel fought to protect. He presented her with the Outstanding Civilian Service Award, a recognition rarely given to someone so young. The weight of the medal in Maya's hands felt substantial, but not as heavy as the weight of understanding that settled over her. She realized that her small actions had rippled outward in ways she'd never anticipated. As she stood beside Mr. Harrison for photographs, she understood that their friendship had meant something beyond the two of them. It had reminded people that in a world often focused on grand gestures and big headlines, the quiet daily choice to care for another person was its own form of heroism. When she returned to her seat beside her mother, Linda squeezed her hand and whispered, "I'm so proud of you, baby." Maya squeezed back, grateful for everything her mother had taught her about giving even when you had little, about seeing people who others overlooked. The ceremony had been attended by a local news crew, and by Monday morning, Maya's story had gone viral. What started as a brief segment on the evening news exploded across social media platforms. People shared the video of the young girl receiving an award for bringing breakfast to a veteran, adding comments about faith in humanity and the importance of teaching children compassion. News outlets from across the country picked up the story, and soon Maya's phone, a basic model her mother had given her for emergencies, was flooded with messages from friends, distant relatives, and even strangers who'd somehow obtained her number. The attention was overwhelming and disorienting. Reporters called the school, requesting interviews. A national morning show wanted Maya and Mr. Harrison to fly to New York to appear live. Local businesses began offering donations and support. A grocery store chain announced they would provide Mr. Harrison with free groceries for life. A national restaurant franchise wanted to create a Maya's Breakfast campaign, donating a portion of proceeds to veteran services. The principal called an assembly where Maya was asked to speak to the entire school, though she'd never been comfortable with public speaking and could barely stammer out a few sentences about just wanting to help a friend. Maya found the sudden fame deeply uncomfortable. She was still just a 12-year-old girl who liked reading books during lunch, who struggled with science homework, and who still sometimes slept with her stuffed rabbit when she was anxious. Now strangers recognized her at the grocery store. Classmates who'd never spoken to her before suddenly wanted to be her friend. Teachers treated her differently, with a kind of reverent praise that made her squirm. She missed the simplicity of her anonymous morning routine, the quiet moments with Mr. Harrison where nobody was watching or judging or filming. Mr. Harrison, too, struggled with the attention. He'd lived decades in quiet anonymity, and suddenly people wanted to interview him about Vietnam, about his service, about his life. Well-meaning veterans groups invited him to events. Strangers thanked him for his service when he went to the pharmacy. While he appreciated the recognition after so many years, he also felt exposed. The nightmares he'd mostly learned to manage returned with intensity, triggered by revisiting memories he'd worked hard to bury. He worried about Maya, seeing how the pressure affected her, how her shy smile became strained during interviews. One evening, about 2 weeks into the media circus, Maya knocked on Mr. Harrison's door at an unusual time, 8 o'clock at night. When he opened it, she was crying. "I just want things to go back to normal," she said. He invited her in, made her tea the way she'd taught him she liked it, and they sat together in companionable silence. Finally, he spoke. "You know what I learned in the Marines, Maya? Sometimes you can't control what's happening around you. You can only control who you are in the middle of it. We didn't ask for this attention, but maybe some good will come from it. And when it all dies down, because it will, we'll still have our mornings together, and that's what really matters." His words soothed her, reminding her of why she'd started this routine in the first place. It had never been about recognition or awards. It had been about connection, about two people finding meaning in taking care of each other. The media attention brought an unexpected consequence that proved more meaningful than any of the official recognition. Letters began arriving at Maya's apartment, hundreds of them from across the country, and eventually from around the world. They came in envelopes decorated with stickers, written on fancy stationery or simple notebook paper, some typed and some in shaky handwriting. Maya's mother helped her open and read them, often finding both of them in tears by the end of an evening's reading session. Many letters came from other veterans who shared their own stories of loneliness and isolation. A man from Oregon wrote about how he'd served in the Gulf War and struggled with PTSD, feeling invisible and forgotten until he saw Maya's story. It reminded him, he wrote, that people still cared about veterans, that the sacrifices hadn't been completely forgotten. A woman who'd served in Iraq described how she'd been living in her car, battling addiction and depression, until seeing the news coverage inspired her to reach out to a veteran support group. She included a photo of herself at a 6-month sobriety ceremony, crediting Maya's example with helping her find the courage to ask for help. Other letters came from young people inspired to start their own community service projects. A group of high school students in Texas had created a program to visit elderly veterans in nursing homes every week. A Boy Scout troop in Michigan had organized a food drive specifically for elderly veterans living alone. A girl Maya's age in California had started bringing groceries to an elderly neighbor who rarely left his apartment. Teachers wrote to say they'd used Maya's story in their classrooms to discuss citizenship and compassion. Parents thanked her for providing an example of kindness in a world that often seemed harsh and self-centered. Perhaps the most touching letters came from elderly people who lived alone. They wrote about the isolation of aging, the way people seemed to stop seeing them, how days could pass without meaningful human contact. A woman in Florida wrote that she'd been planning to end her life, feeling that no one would notice or care if she was gone, but Maya's story made her reconsider. She'd reached out to a local church group and found a community that welcomed her. A retired teacher in Ohio wrote about how he'd stopped bothering to cook real meals for himself, eating from cans standing at the sink, until Maya's story reminded him that he was still worth taking care of. He included a picture of a proper dinner he'd made for himself, set nicely at his table. Maya kept every letter in a large box under her bed, and on difficult days when the attention felt like too much, she would take them out and read them. They reminded her that while she couldn't control the media frenzy or the public recognition, her simple action had created ripples of kindness spreading outward in ways she'd never imagined. Mr. Harrison helped her respond to many of the letters, and together they spent evenings composing replies. He'd lived long enough to understand that sometimes the smallest gestures created the biggest impacts, that one person choosing kindness could inspire others to do the same, creating a cascade of compassion that reached farther than any individual act could alone. 6 months after the ceremony, Colonel Davis approached Maya and her mother with a proposal that would change their lives in unexpected ways. Moved by the response to Maya's story and the hundreds of letters from isolated veterans and inspired young people, a group of retired military officers and civilian supporters wanted to establish the Maya Harrison Foundation for Veteran Support. The foundation would focus on connecting young volunteers with elderly veterans in their communities, providing both material support and companionship. They wanted Maya to be the face of the organization and Mr. Harrison to serve as an advisor. Linda Washington was initially hesitant. She worried about the time commitment and whether this would interfere with Maya's education and childhood. She also worried about people exploiting her daughter's kindness for fundraising purposes. But after several meetings with Colonel Davis and the proposed board members, which included social workers, veteran advocates, and community organizers, she began to see the potential. The foundation would provide a small stipend that would help with their financial struggles. More importantly, it would formalize and expand what Maya had been doing informally, creating a structure that could help many more veterans and young people. Maya herself had mixed feelings. She never sought to be the leader of an organization or a public figure. The idea of speaking at events and fundraisers terrified her. But when she visited a veterans center with Colonel Davis and met dozens of elderly former service members living in isolation, many with no family and few visitors, her hesitation melted. She saw Mr. Harrison's face multiplied across all these people, dignified individuals with rich histories who'd become invisible in their old age. She understood that she had a unique opportunity to help create something that could bring meaning to many lives, both young and old. The foundation launched with a pilot program in 3 cities, carefully matching young volunteers with elderly veterans after thorough background checks and training sessions. Maya helped develop the training materials, working with social workers to create guidelines that respected both the veterans' dignity and the young people's safety. They established protocols for dealing with mental health issues, physical care needs, and emergency situations. The program emphasized that volunteers weren't just delivering services, but building genuine relationships based on mutual respect and interest. The response was overwhelming. Within 6 months, they had waitlists in every pilot city, both veterans requesting companionship and young people wanting to volunteer. Local news covered heartwarming stories of relationships forming across generational divides. A 15-year-old boy in Denver became close friends with a Korean War veteran who taught him woodworking. A group of girls in Atlanta organized weekly dinners for several female veterans who'd served as military nurses. The foundation documented these connections, sharing stories that illustrated how both parties benefited. The veterans gained companionship and support, while the young people learned history, developed empathy, and gained perspective that their phone-focused generation often lacked. Maya attended quarterly board meetings, usually overwhelmed by the formal discussions, but always clear on the mission's heart. This wasn't about her anymore. It was about honoring all the Mr. Harrisons who'd served their country and deserved to be remembered and valued in their final years. As the foundation expanded into its 2nd year, Maya was now 14 years old and facing the typical challenges of adolescence alongside the unusual responsibilities of being a foundation spokesperson. She struggled to balance homework, friendships, her ongoing morning visits with Mr. Harrison, and the increasing demands of the foundation. There were speaking engagements at veteran events, fundraising dinners where she had to make awkward small talk with wealthy donors, and strategic planning meetings where adults looked to her for input she often didn't feel qualified to give. The foundation also encountered obstacles that naive optimism hadn't anticipated. Not all volunteer veteran matches worked well. Some young people signed up for the wrong reasons, to pad college applications rather than genuine interest in helping others. Some veterans were too physically or mentally ill to safely participate in the program without more professional support than teenage volunteers could provide. There were complaints from veterans who felt patronized by the program, who didn't want charity from children. An incident in one city, where a volunteer stole from a veteran's home, prompted a complete overhaul of screening procedures and caused temporary damage to the foundation's reputation. Maya also faced personal criticism as she grew older. Some people accused the foundation of exploiting her story for donations. Anonymous comments online suggested she was just a diversity poster child for an organization really run by white military officers. Others criticized her for accepting the stipend the foundation provided, calling her a hypocrite who profited from kindness that should be freely given. These attacks hurt, especially because they questioned the sincerity of her original actions with Mr. Harrison. Her mother tried to shield her from the worst of it, but in the age of social media, protection was limited. Mr. Harrison's health began declining during this period, which added to Maya's stress and sadness. At 82, he developed heart problems that required medication and careful monitoring. He moved more slowly, tired more easily, and some mornings when Maya arrived with breakfast, he was too exhausted to eat much. She adjusted her routine, bringing lighter foods and staying longer to help with small tasks he could no longer easily manage. She noticed him forgetting things occasionally, repeating stories he'd told the week before, misplacing his keys, losing track of what day it was. The doctors mentioned early dementia, words that terrified Maya because she couldn't imagine a world without Mr. Harrison's steady presence and quiet wisdom. Despite these challenges, the foundation persisted and grew. They refined their matching process, added mental health professionals to their team, and created better support systems for volunteers facing difficult situations. Maya found her voice at meetings, becoming more confident in expressing what the program should be about: authentic connection rather than performative charity. She insisted they add a component educating young volunteers about military history and the specific conflicts their veteran partners had experienced. She pushed back when donors wanted to add requirements that would make the program feel transactional rather than relational. And through it all, she continued her morning visits to Mr. Harrison, the original relationship that had started everything, determined to honor it even as life became increasingly complicated around them both. Maya was 16 when Mr. Harrison was hospitalized with congestive heart failure. She'd arrived one morning to find him on the floor, conscious, but unable to get up, having fallen during the night. The paramedics praised her for calling 911 immediately and staying calm, but Maya felt anything but calm. At the hospital, she sat in the waiting room with her mother, terrified that she might lose the person who'd become like a grandfather to her. The doctors managed to stabilize him, but the message was clear. His time was limited, perhaps measured in months rather than years. Mr. Harrison spent 2 weeks in the hospital before moving to a rehabilitation facility. Maya visited every day after school, sometimes just sitting beside his bed doing homework while he slept. On his clearer days, they talked about memories from their 7 years of friendship. He reminded her of the first morning she'd knocked on his door, how surprised he'd been that this young girl had thought to bring breakfast to a stranger. He told her again about Vietnam, but also about other things he'd never shared: his brief marriage, his childhood in rural Alabama, his dreams of being a teacher that he'd never pursued. It was as if he was organizing his life story for her, making sure the important parts were preserved. One afternoon, Mr. Harrison asked to speak with Maya alone. When her mother stepped out, he reached for the drawer beside his bed and pulled out a folder of documents. Inside were the deed to his apartment, paid off decades ago, and a simple will naming Maya as his beneficiary. "I don't have much," he said, his voice weak but determined, "but what I have should go to you. That apartment, the little bit in my savings account, my military benefits. Your mother can help you figure out the details, but I want you to know you've been the greatest gift of my old age. Let me give you something back." Maya couldn't speak through her tears. She'd never expected anything from Mr. Harrison, except his company and friendship. The idea that he'd planned for her future this way overwhelmed her. But he wasn't finished. He also gave her a letter he'd written for the Foundation's board, recommending that as she came of age, she should transition from being the symbolic face of the organization to taking a real leadership role in its direction. He'd outlined his vision for the Foundation's future, suggesting programs to expand into rural areas where isolated veterans were most forgotten, and initiatives to preserve veterans' oral histories through the young volunteers who visited them. Mr. Harrison died 3 weeks later, peacefully in his sleep at the facility. Maya was in school when she got the call, and the grief hit her like a physical blow. Her mother picked her up early, and they went together to the facility to say goodbye. Seeing his still form, Maya understood fully for the first time what mortality meant: that people you love leave, that time is finite, that every morning she'd brought him breakfast had been precious because it couldn't last forever. At his funeral, organized by the Foundation with full military honors, Maya delivered a eulogy that left not a dry eye in the room. She spoke about an ordinary friendship that had changed her life, about a man who'd served his country in war and then taught a young girl about dignity, consistency, and the quiet heroism of continuing to show up for people who need you. 2 years after Mr. Harrison's death, Maya stood in the living room of the apartment that had been his and was now hers. At 18, she'd just graduated from high school and was preparing to attend college on a scholarship established in Mr. Harrison's name. The apartment had become the Foundation's informal headquarters. She'd converted his bedroom into an office space where she coordinated the volunteer program that had now expanded to 23 cities and matched over 1,500 young people with elderly veterans. The Foundation had evolved significantly under Maya's increasingly active leadership. They'd added a digital storytelling component where volunteers recorded videos of veterans sharing their life stories, creating an archive of military and American history told through personal narratives. They'd partnered with schools to make veteran volunteering part of service learning curricula. They'd even expanded internationally, with pilot programs in the UK and Australia adapting the model for their own veteran populations. Maya had become comfortable with public speaking, traveling to conferences and military bases to talk about intergenerational connection and the responsibility civilians have to veterans. But Maya's favorite part of the work remained the most personal. Every morning before classes, she still prepared breakfast and walked to a nearby veteran's home. After Mr. Harrison died, she'd initially thought she couldn't possibly replicate that relationship with anyone else. But Colonel Davis had gently encouraged her to try, and she'd been matched with Mrs. Patricia Johnson, an 85-year-old woman who'd served as a military nurse in Vietnam. Their relationship was different from what she'd had with Mr. Harrison. Mrs. Johnson was more talkative, had stronger opinions, and loved to teach Maya to cook Southern recipes from her childhood. But it was equally meaningful, a reminder that the Foundation's mission wasn't about replicating a single special friendship, but about creating the conditions for many such friendships to flourish. Linda Washington often reflected on how much had changed since that first morning when her daughter had asked to bring breakfast to an elderly neighbor. The small stipend from the Foundation had grown into a salary that had allowed Linda to quit one of her jobs and spend more time at home. She'd watched Maya transform from a shy 12-year-old into a confident young woman with purpose and direction. The apartment they'd inherited had been sold, with the money put into a trust for Maya's education and future. More than the material changes, though, Linda saw how her daughter had developed a deep sense of meaning and connection that many people searched their whole lives to find. As Maya prepared for college, planning to study social work with a focus on veteran services, she often thought about the unpredictable nature of kindness. She'd simply wanted to help a lonely old man, never imagining it would become her life's work, never suspecting that a small gesture would ripple outward to touch thousands of lives. On the wall of the apartment office, she'd hung that photograph of young soldiers that had been in Mr. Harrison's apartment, the one he used to stare at with such longing. Beside it, she'd placed a photo from the medal ceremony, her 12-year-old self standing next to Mr. Harrison in his Marine uniform, both of them looking slightly overwhelmed but genuinely happy. Between those two images hung dozens of photos sent by Foundation volunteers and veterans across the country, snapshots of breakfasts shared, gardens tended together, birthdays celebrated, friendships formed across generations and experiences. Looking at this collage, Maya understood that Mr. Harrison's legacy wasn't just the apartment or the Foundation, or even the Bronze Star he'd finally received. His legacy was the lesson that had been lived out through their friendship and now multiplied through hundreds of others, that everyone deserves to be seen, that no one should be forgotten, and that sometimes the most profound impact comes not from grand gestures, but from the simple, faithful choice to show up for another person, morning after morning, with nothing more than breakfast and the gift of presence.